The danger began before they even stepped off the platform, though none of them realized it yet, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to tremble in silent warning. The winter air at the Soviet border carried a metallic taste, as if the night itself was watching, waiting, listening for the wrong move. The Carter family had believed their holiday through Eastern Europe would be a simple escape. But the moment they entered this forgotten corner of the Cold War, they walked into a trap quietly set for strangers like them. The station smelled of damp concrete and diesel smoke as they dragged their bags toward the customs checkpoint. Michael tried to smile through the tension weighing on his shoulders. Clara clutched Emily, who seemed more annoyed than afraid by the grim environment. They had planned only one night before traveling toward coastal resorts deemed safe for tourists, unaware that someone had been tracking their itinerary from the moment it was mailed to their home. From a flickering corner, a man watched them with the patience of a hunter. He did not move closer, never looked directly, yet every subtle shift of their posture was recorded. His coat was thick wool, and his boots silent as he melted into deeper shadows. He had been told a target would arrive with a wife and child, and that a package must be recovered before it left Soviet territory. Details did not matter. The order was enough. Emily sensed the observation and brushed it away as travel nerves. Footsteps echoed behind them, but when she turned, only strangers rushed past. Uniformed officers marched stiffly across the hall, their presence making Michael swallow hard as he adjusted documents in his jacket. He told himself they had nothing to fear, a lie he barely believed. Approaching the immigration booth, Clara felt a subtle vibration in the floor, the officers stiffening almost imperceptibly. One murmured into a concealed radio, and the light above blinked twice. The Carter family stepped forward, unaware the signal was meant for them. The clerk examined their papers with deadened eyes, hand lingering over Michael's passport as if searching for a hidden mark. When he stamped it, a brief glance exchanged with another officer set something dangerous in motion. The man in the shadows by the pillar began following at a slow, deliberate pace, making Clara's neck prickle. Outside, the night pressed in cold and stale. They loaded luggage into a taxi and climbed inside. The driver barely acknowledged them, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror too often. As the headlights swept past the station entrance, Clara saw the shadowed figure step from the doorway, watching the taxi fade into darkness. Her pulse quickened, but she said nothing. Inside, Emily reached for her mother's hand, whispering she did not like the feeling of the place. Michael reassured her it was just fatigue and culture shock. But as the taxi turned down a narrow street bordered by crumbling walls and unlit alleys, the engine echoed strangely, and cold stones seeped through the vents. Michael's unease grew with every second. Ahead, a second car appeared, headlights dimmed. The taxi slowed, waiting. Emily's breath caught as the shadowed figure from the station stepped from the passenger side, wearing the same long coat and expressionless stare. Michael tried to open the door, but the locks clicked before he could pull the handle. Clara shielded Emily as the stranger approached, gloved hand tapping the window. There was no urgency, no emotion, only intent that made the night itself feel sharper. The man leaned down, face half in shadow, speaking in a low, controlled voice, demanding they step out and follow quietly. He said there were questions to answer and that this was no ordinary vacation. The cold pressed in, and Michael realized something had gone very wrong long before they reached this place. Trembling, the family stepped out, unaware they had taken the first step into a deadly chain of events orchestrated by forces they could neither see nor understand. The night wind carried a bitter silence as the Carter family stood trembling in the alley, with stone walls rising around them like the jaws of a trap. Michael placed himself in front of Clara and Emily, trying to keep his voice steady, but his words felt thin in the cold air. He demanded to know what was happening, but the man in the long coat simply watched with calm certainty. The other officer approached from behind the sedan, his boots pressing softly against the wet stones. leaving dark impressions that lingered like stains. Emily shivered as the cold seeped through her jacket. Her heart thudded unevenly as she looked up at the towering man, moving without sound or hesitation. Clara kept her hand on her daughter's shoulder and asked why they had been brought here. The man did not answer, instead motioning for them to follow with a flick of his fingers before turning away. Michael hesitated only long enough to glance back. The taxi was gone, the street empty, no escape except through the men waiting to enforce compliance if needed. He guided his family forward, footsteps echoing faintly, each sound marking their fear. They were led to a small metal door set into the side of a boarded-up warehouse. A faint bulb flickered behind a high window, hinting at activity within. The long-coated man opened the door and gestured for them to enter. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old machinery, and something darker. The room was lit by a single swinging light, revealing metal chairs and a wide stain on the concrete floor that made Clara's breath catch. The second officer closed the door with a dull echo, sealing them inside. Michael felt the urge to run, but the cold stare of the first officer froze him. Clara tightened her grip on Emily's hand, while Emily stood rigid, pretending she was not shaking. The man in the long coat stepped into the light, folding his hands behind his back. His movements were precise, almost ceremonial. He began questioning Michael in a steady monotone that vibrated through the hollow space. The questions were not about tourism. They asked why the family had chosen this route through Eastern Europe, who recommended their hotel, and whether anyone had given them a package or document before leaving home. Michael insisted they were only on vacation. The officer studied him without blinking, then stepped closer, revealing a scar from his hairline to his jaw that made his expression permanently disapproving. He said someone had used an American family's identity to smuggle information across the border. Their itinerary matched a courier who disappeared 2 days earlier. The package had not been recovered, and someone in the family must know where it was. Clara tried to explain they knew nothing. Emily looked from her parents to the officers, wide-eyed, as if questioning whether this was a mistake or something far worse. Michael stepped forward to assert control, but a look between the officers sent a chill through him. Suddenly, the second officer opened a folder and placed it on the table. Inside were photographs of a man who looked nothing like Michael, yet carried a passport with his name. Clara's hand went to her mouth in shock. Emily whispered that it had to be a mistake, someone had set them up. The officers showed no interest in innocence. They wanted the missing information. The man in the long coat stepped close, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Mistakes did not happen here," he said. "Only choices and consequences." The family had stepped into something they could not walk away from. A metallic clang echoed somewhere deeper, startling them. The officers' heads turned, but their expressions did not change. Emily pressed closer to Clara, whispering she wanted to leave. Clara whispered back that they would find a way. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears. The officers were not just gathering information. They were waiting for something. The man walked to a far wall, pressed his palm against a panel, and it slid open with a harsh buzz, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. He motioned for them to follow. Michael tried to protest, but the second officer stepped behind them with cold steadiness. Clara whispered a prayer, and Emily clung to her father's sleeve. Their instincts screamed that descending would lead to something far more dangerous than the alley or warehouse above. And yet, they moved forward. The stairwell swallowed the light as they descended one step at a time. The air grew colder, the walls tighter, shadows deepened. When they reached the bottom, the door slid shut above them, sealing them in a place where no one outside would know they had disappeared. The underground chamber breathed a cold stillness that made the Carter family feel as if they had stepped into a forgotten cavity beneath the earth, where no sound was meant to escape. The air smelled of metal and old water, and a faint drip echoed slowly through the room. The walls were raw concrete, streaked with moisture that shimmered faintly in the dim light, and shadows pooled in corners like waiting predators. Clara wrapped her arms around herself as they were guided toward the metal table that had seen too many secrets and too much fear. Emily clung to her father, hoping that staying close would keep them safe, her small frame trembling. Michael felt the weight of the room pressing into him. It was clear this place was built to break people down. No windows, no vents, no sense of time. Only the flickering bulb above and the two officers whose expressions revealed nothing. The man in the long coat gestured for Michael to sit, his movements deliberate and measured. The second officer stood by the door, blocking the exit with a posture that felt like a warning carved into stone. Once Michael sat, the long-coated officer leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. His knuckles were scarred and his nails trimmed to a precise edge. He repeated the questions asked upstairs, but this time with pressure that seemed designed to crack resolve. He asked about their itinerary, why they traveled when most tourists avoided the region, and whether they knew a man named Aron Veskov or had been contacted during their trip. Michael shook his head, insisting their trip was innocent, but the officer gave no reaction. Clara tried to explain they were just a family on vacation, but the second officer raised a hand for silence. Emily's breathing quickened as she realized no one had ever left this place. Fear tightened its grip, making her legs tremble. The first officer opened a thin folder and slid a grainy sheet toward Michael. It showed a man in a crowded marketplace, wearing a coat almost identical to Michael's, handing off a small envelope to someone obscured by the crowd. The timestamp showed the photo was taken earlier that day. Michael stared in disbelief as the officer explained that this courier had been tracked for weeks and had boarded the same train the Carters took, vanishing moments before the final stop when someone else stepped off in his place. Michael tried to argue, but the officer cut him off with a warning about the consequences of lying. The words hung heavy in the stale air. Clara stepped back instinctively, shadows seeming to thicken around them. Emily clutched her father's arm, whispering that they should tell the officers anything, even if they had nothing. Michael squeezed her hand and whispered they would get through this, though his certainty was fading. A faint rumble shook the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling and the bulb flickered. Both officers paused, exchanging a brief, urgent glance. Something was happening outside, something unanticipated. The long-coated man pressed his ear to the wall, listening, then straightened with a look hinting at an unspoken threat. Emily whispered that she heard distant voices. Clara recognized muffled thuds and hurried footsteps beyond the concrete walls. The second officer unlocked the door and stepped into the corridor, glancing back as a warning. The first officer moved toward the doorway but paused, torn between continuing the interrogation and investigating the disturbance. Michael asked why they had been targeted. The officer's expression shifted slightly, recognition, suspicion, or perhaps fear. He explained that the courier had stolen information capable of igniting an international crisis, and that forged documents made the Carters appear involved. The courier may not have vanished, but might have passed something to them unknowingly. Clara stepped protectively in front of Emily, insisting they had never seen the courier. The officer asked if anything unusual had been slipped into their luggage, or if anyone had bumped them during the trip. Emily suddenly recalled a man on the train brushing past her, apologizing with a nervous accent. Michael realized with growing dread she had just described the courier. A violent pounding erupted on the chamber door, sending the metal vibrating. The long-coated officer drew a deep breath, telling the family that whoever had entered the tunnels was not his people, and that the courier must have left the stolen material with them. The pounding grew louder, and the bulb flickered, casting twisting shadows across the walls, as if the room itself reacted to the chaos outside. The steel door shuddered again, as if something on the other side was determined to break through, and each impact made Clara flinch, and Emily bury her face against her mother's arm. Michael felt the instinctive urge to run, but there was nowhere to go, and the officer in the long coat stood motionless beside the door, as though bracing himself for whatever waited beyond it. The air seemed to vibrate with contained panic, and the dim chamber felt smaller with every passing second. A faint crack appeared along the door frame, releasing a thin trail of dust that drifted downward like falling ash. The officer stepped back with a steadying breath. His earlier control had shifted into something sharper and more urgent. He told Michael quietly that whoever stood behind the door was not here to negotiate, and that the family needed to move deeper into the tunnels before the intruder forced their way inside. Michael hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding and taking Clara's hand. Emily clung to both of them as the officer pushed open a second narrow passage leading away from the chamber. The corridor beyond was colder than the room they left behind, and the only light came from an occasional bulb flickering weakly overhead. Their footsteps echoed in the tight space, creating the unsettling feeling that someone else was following close behind them. Clara whispered Michael's name as her fear rose in her throat, but he urged her forward, reminding her that staying still would mean being trapped. Emily glanced back repeatedly, convinced that she saw shadows shifting at the far end of the passage, even though nothing moved except the trembling light above them. A loud crash erupted behind them as the steel door finally gave way, and the impact sent a shiver down the corridor. Clara gasped, and the officer motioned for silence as he led them faster through a twisting turn that branched into a larger tunnel. The air smelled of damp stone and distant smoke. The walls carried faint scuff marks, as though others had run through this path before, and the thought made Emily's pulse quicken. She asked her father what the people behind them wanted, and he told her they would be safe soon, even though his voice betrayed doubt. The officer stopped abruptly and pressed his hand against a metal panel set into the wall. It clicked open to reveal a cramped maintenance room, with a ladder leading up into darkness. He instructed the family to climb quickly while he stayed behind to stall whoever was pursuing them. Clara refused to leave him alone, but the officer insisted that nothing mattered more than keeping the family away from the intruder. Michael began climbing, first pulling Emily behind him while Clara followed close enough to feel her daughter's trembling legs. The maintenance shaft swallowed them in near total darkness, with only a faint glow from the corridor below. They heard the footsteps of the intruder approaching, and a muffled exchange of words filled with tension. The officer's voice was low and steady, and the stranger's voice was sharper and angry. Emily held her breath as the murmur of voices grew into a sudden struggle that echoed through the shaft. Clara pressed her hand over her daughter's mouth to quiet her, and Michael urged them upward as fast as they could manage. A second later, a gunshot cracked through the underground silence. The sound reverberated through the narrow shaft and made Emily cry out despite her mother's grip. Clara froze for a moment as fear locked her limbs, but Michael urged both of them onward until they reached a hatch above them. He pushed against it with all his strength until it finally gave way to an abandoned storage chamber filled with broken crates and dust-covered tools. They climbed out and pulled the hatch shut just as the faint sound of footsteps returned below. Clara leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing, while Emily wiped her tears with trembling hands. Michael moved toward the single doorway that led deeper into the building and listened intently for any sign of movement. The world above ground suddenly felt impossibly far away, and each sound in the darkness carried the weight of unknown danger. He whispered that they needed to keep moving before whoever survived the fight below climbed after them. Clara reached for Emily, and the family stepped quietly into the next corridor, unaware that they had only reached the beginning of a much larger trap waiting to close around them. The storage room opened into a wide industrial space that felt forgotten by the world above. Dust rose around their footsteps as the Carter family moved cautiously across the cracked concrete floor. The faint moonlight through the broken window gave the room an eerie glow, and every shadow seemed capable of hiding the figure who had chased them from the depths below. Clara held Emily's hand tightly, while Michael led the way toward the stairwell at the far end of the room, hoping it would take them closer to the surface. A distant clang echoed somewhere deeper in the building, and the family froze. The sound was soft but deliberate, as though someone had lightly kicked a loose pipe to test whether they were still moving. Michael motioned for quiet, and they continued forward with slow steps. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she felt eyes pressing against her back. Clara whispered that they were almost safe, though she could feel her voice trembling. When they reached the stairwell, Michael paused to listen. The air felt warmer here, as if someone had recently passed through and left traces of breath stirring the dust. He guided Clara and Emily upward, while trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that they were heading straight toward another trap. Halfway up the steps, a faint creak echoed below them, and Emily let out a quiet gasp. Clara urged her to keep climbing, and Michael quickened his pace. The stairs led to a narrow hallway lined with old office doors, many hanging crooked or broken. Papers littered the floor as though someone had rifled through the space in a hurry. Michael stepped over the debris and checked each corner before allowing Clara and Emily to move forward. The faint hum of distant machinery suggested they were nearing an active part of the building, but they could not tell whether that would bring safety or more danger. Clara spotted a window at the end of the hall and hurried toward it. She brushed away the grime and peered outside, only to see an empty courtyard surrounded by tall concrete walls. No street, no exit, no sign of life. Just another sealed pocket of darkness that trapped them deeper inside the structure. Emily whispered that the place felt wrong, and Michael agreed, sensing that the building had been repurposed for something secret and hostile long before they stumbled into it. Before they could decide their next move, a faint clicking sound drifted through the hall. It was soft and evenly spaced, like footsteps taken with deliberate care. Michael stepped back from the window and positioned himself between his family and the direction of the noise. Clara pulled Emily close and waited breathlessly as the clicking grew louder, then stopped just around the corner. A shadow stretched across the far wall. Slow, purposeful, searching. Michael held a finger to his lips and guided Clara and Emily toward the nearest office door. They slipped inside and pressed themselves against the wall as the footsteps continued past the doorway. Emily trembled in her mother's arms as the shadow paused just outside the room. Michael held his breath until his lungs screamed and only allowed himself to inhale when the steps finally resumed and faded into the distance. He whispered that they could not stay here. They needed to reach the roof or find another exit before the stranger doubled back. Clara nodded and took Emily's hand again. Together, they stepped silently out of the office and continued down the hall toward another stairwell they prayed would bring them closer to escape. But none of them noticed the small motion sensor tucked beneath the broken light fixture above them. Its red indicator blinked once as they passed, then flickered again as if waking from long dormancy and transmitting their position to someone unseen. The stairwell felt endless as the Carter family climbed, each step echoing in the metal shaft like a countdown. Clara gripped Emily's hand so tightly her knuckles ached, and Michael felt a cold sweat running down his spine as he led them upward, listening for any sign of pursuit. The building around them groaned with age, each creak and drip amplifying the sense that someone or something was tracking their every movement. Emily whispered that she could hear whispers just beyond the wall, but when Michael strained his ears, there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being hunted pressed down on them heavier than the weight of the building itself. Halfway up, the stairwell opened onto a small landing cluttered with rusted machinery and broken crates. The faint light from the cracked skylight above barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Michael motioned for the others to stay low and led them along the edge, careful not to disturb any loose metal that might give away their position. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps, and Emily's small frame trembled against her mother. But Michael forced himself to focus on the path ahead. From somewhere below, a distant thud echoed through the shaft, sending vibrations up the stairs. The family froze, their hearts hammering in unison. The sound was deliberate, measured, like someone testing whether the prey was still alive. Michael whispered that they had to keep moving and pushed onward toward the next flight. The upper levels smelled faintly of smoke and oil, an odor that suggested activity and danger just beyond the landing. Reaching the final stretch of stairs, they found a partially open door leading onto the roof. The morning light hit their faces, giving a false sense of relief. Outside, the roof was narrow and littered with debris, the edges sheer drops into the industrial complex below. Michael glanced around, seeing nothing at first, then caught movement near the opposite edge of the building. A figure crouched in the shadows, watching, almost perfectly still. Clara pressed Emily closer to him, and he whispered that they were not safe yet. Emily squinted and asked if the person could be another officer. Michael shook his head. Whoever it was had waited for them to reach this point, silent and patient. And there was an unmistakable malice in the way they watched. The figure vanished suddenly, as if slipping into the thin morning fog that crept along the rooftops. Michael knew then that this was not random. They had been led through the building, and every step had been anticipated, every hiding place calculated. He guided Clara and Emily along the roof toward a fire escape at the far end. Each footfall felt like it could be the one that triggered detection. Emily clung to his arm, whispering that she did not want to fall. Michael murmured back that they were close, that they had to keep going. Behind them, faint footsteps echoed across the metal surfaces of the lower roof, confirming that the watcher was still near. The fire escape led to a narrow ledge overlooking a small courtyard below, fenced in and deserted. Michael looked down, calculating the drop, the walls, and the risk. Clara hesitated, fear etching her face, but Michael offered a firm grip, and they edged along the ledge, one careful step at a time, hoping the unknown figure above or behind did not decide to intervene. Every motion was slow, deliberate, and measured, but the danger pressed closer with each heartbeat. Just as they reached a gap where they could climb down onto the courtyard roof safely, a sharp metallic click came from the rooftop behind them. Michael froze, recognizing the sound immediately as a firearm being readied. The shadowed figure had returned, and the moment of confrontation they had been avoiding for hours was finally imminent. The Carter family thought they were on a harmless vacation, but from the moment they stepped off the train in Eastern Europe, the danger was already waiting. The station smelled of diesel and damp stone, the air heavy with quiet menace. A shadowed figure tracked their every move, blending into the night as if the family's path had been mapped long before they arrived. Michael adjusted his passport nervously, unaware that it had been forged and duplicated, linking them unknowingly to a missing courier. Clara clutched Emily's hand, sensing danger she could not yet name. Outside the station, their taxi carried them along narrow streets, headlights illuminating dark alleys where another shadow seemed to follow, silent and patient. A tap on the window revealed the inevitable. The strangers were waiting for them. Without explanation, they were guided into a warehouse, a decaying labyrinth of concrete and steel, where the air smelled of dust and something darker. Questions followed, relentless, about documents, names, and contacts they had never known. Photographs of a man using Michael's identity confirmed the trap. The Carters had been pawns in a dangerous espionage operation. Led deeper underground, the family faced an interrogation chamber, stark and claustrophobic. Shadows stretched along the walls as footsteps and whispers echoed through the tunnels, suggesting they were not alone. Emily recalled a man brushing past her on the train, a fleeting memory now charged with terror. The officers revealed that someone else had infiltrated the facility, intent on recovering the missing package, and the Carters might unknowingly carry it. Every corridor became a test, each step calculated by unseen enemies. They navigated stairwells and abandoned offices, dust rising under their careful footsteps, avoiding shadows that seemed to move independently. Motion sensors blinked silently above them, transmitting their position. The family climbed fire escapes and narrow ledges, each action a gamble between survival and detection. At every turn, they sensed eyes on them, guns poised, a pursuer unseen but always present. Finally, they reached the courtyard roof, confronted by a shadowed figure holding a pistol. Heart racing, Michael guided Clara and Emily along a ledge to a fire escape and down into a narrow alley. Gunshots echoed behind them, the threat lingering in every shadow. When they thought they had escaped, an envelope dropped at their feet, containing photographs and documents, revealing the full scope of the operation that had ensnared them. The family ran into the streets, burdened by the knowledge that their ordeal was far from over. Someone was still watching, waiting, and the secrets they now held were only a fragment of a larger, hidden danger. The dawn light could not erase the darkness that followed them, and the truth remained shrouded in shadows, waiting for the moment to strike again. If you thought the Carters' escape was intense, the truth behind the operation is even darker and more twisted than they could ever imagine. What would you do if you were caught in a trap you didn't even know existed? Don't miss the next chapter of this Cold War mystery. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the secrets, the spies, and the danger that still lurks in the shadows. Comment below what you think happened to the Carters after that envelope appeared, and share this video if you love real-life spy stories that keep you on the edge of your seat.